When we are working with any web project, we first need a database, and that is the heart of the application. In this case also, we will have to add a database, and we will be doing that using SQL Server. But for database, I will be using Entity Framework Core code first, and in that we create a model, and based on that model, we create a database table. So first we will have to create a model in our project. So we will create a new folder, call it as model. Inside there, we will create our first class file, which will be category. Inside this class, we will have to create all the properties for all the columns that we want in the table. Let's say we want 3 columns. We want name of the category, we want a display order, and the last one will actually be the most important one. All the tables require a primary key. So we will be adding an ID column, which will be identity column in SQL Server. What I mean by that is when we create any record, we do not have to pass that ID. It will automatically increment by 1 every time a new record is created, and that will be unique. So for all the 3 columns, we will have to create 3 properties. The first one should be the primary key. So for that, we will type prop here, which is a snippet to create properties inside Visual Studio. So we type prop and we press tab 2 times. It creates an integer by default. That's fine. We want to call that as ID. The next property that we want is name of the category, which will be a string, and we will call that as name. The last one will be an integer of display order. So with this, we have created a class which will be our table in the database, and it will have 3 properties or 3 columns. Now before we magically create the table, we need to do some more configuration. Let's take a look at that in the next video. We will be using Entity Framework Core to create the table and populate details inside there. But when we create a table, we need to tell Entity Framework Core that this column will be an identity column and it will be a primary key. Let's say we also want to add a validation that this name should be a required and not null property inside database. So how can we add all of those validations and requirements? We have many attributes that are available to define all of the requirements, and all of them are defined inside data annotations. So before the property here, we can give that an attribute inside a square bracket. The attribute to make this column a primary key is key itself. You will have to press Ctrl dot here to add the using statement, and you will press enter. Now by default, if a property name is ID, Entity Framework Core automatically makes it a primary key. So this is optional. But if your name was something different, like let's say you wanted to make display order a primary key, then you will have to explicitly say that. But if it is an ID and if you have not defined any primary key, then it will automatically set that as a primary key. That is good to know, but I always like to explicitly define so that when someone opens up that model, they can directly say which one is the primary key. Next, we want name to be a required, and for that we have an attribute which is required. That will make sure that name is a required property when the SQL statement is created to actually create this category table, which we will see in the upcoming videos. Right now, things are pretty simple. We created a class file, it has few properties, and we added some easy-looking data annotations for our requirement. How will we actually create this table and database? That is the main question. For that, we will have to do some configuration, like adding a connection string to our SQL Server, adding some NuGet packages so that we can use Entity Framework Core and SQL Server with our project. Don't be overwhelmed. Let's get started by adding the connection string in the next video. In this video, we have to add connection string. So before we do that, let me open up SQL Server Management Studio. Here, the first thing that you require is a server name. Now, many times a dot will work for localhost, but if that does not work, you can try localDB, MS SQL localDB. Whichever server name works for you where you can connect, that is the one that you will use. I'm going to use just a dot because that is working and that's how I have configured SQL Server. I don't want the long one, so I'll just use the dot. Once you are able to connect here to SQL Server, we will go back to our project and we will add our connection string. Now where exactly will we add that connection string? All of the settings like secrets that you have in the application, you should add that inside appsettings.json. If you examine, we also have development here. So if you have more versions like production, staging, preview, for each one of them, we might have different settings. So you can add different settings inside the individual file, and based on the environment name, it will automatically use the correct settings. For our localhost, we will use appsettings.json. So inside appsettings.json, if you examine, we have some key value configuration. We have a block, inside that we have another block, and finally we have key value settings. When we are working with connection string, we can directly create a key value pair right here. But connection string is something that is common across all the application. That's why .NET Core team has provided a special block that you can use for connection strings if you want. Using that will make things a little simple, but if you want to go with a custom block, that will also work. You will just have to put some extra effort to retrieve the connection string. We will use the default connection string block that is provided with .NET Core, and that is connection strings. Once you press enter there, you will notice the curly brackets. This means it is a block. In there, we can write our connection string. You can give that any key name that you want. I'm going to call this default connection. And after a colon in the double quotes, you will write your connection string. The first parameter here will be the server name. You will write equal to, and then whatever server you are able to connect in SQL Server, copy that and write that here. I'm using a dot, so that is what I will use. Then we will add a semicolon and we will add the database name. You can call your database whatever you want. I'm going to use Abby. Finally, we will have the security, which is trusted connection is equal to true. That's all that we need for connection string. The trusted connection is because I'm using Windows authentication to connect to my SQL Server. So with that, we have added connection string in our project. But we need to configure our DB context so we can use this connection string and configure Entity Framework Core in our application. It might seem daunting in the beginning, but do not worry. Once we set everything up, it will all make sense. Let's continue in the next video. Now we have our connection string, we have our category model. How do we add this model to database? In order to do that, we will require Entity Framework Core in our project. So you will right-click on your project and you can select Manage NuGet Packages. Once you go there, we will have to install a package. Inside the browse, we will search for Entity Framework Core. We have the first package here, and I have enabled the include pre-release because right now .NET 6 is in preview. So we will install that package in our project. Now while we are here, I know we will be using SQL Server and that requires its own package as well. So make sure you search for SQL, and we have Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.sql server. Now when you install NuGet packages, if you are using the preview version or even if you are using the older version, always make sure that all the packages in a project must be of the same version. If you install one package in preview 7 and other in preview 6, it might not work. Or if you install one package in .NET 5 and other in .NET 6, it still might not work. So it has to be the same version, or else you might face issues later on. That being said, I will install both the NuGet packages so that we can add the configuration of Entity Framework Core in our project. Perfect, we will close the NuGet package manager, and now we need to create a DB context so that we can interact with Entity Framework Core for database. So inside the project, we will right-click, add a new folder for data. Inside there, we will have to create our class file for accessing the DB context. You can call this anything you want. I like to call that application DB context. Now this file will implement the DB context, or it will be like a data layer that will connect our application with the database. So it must implement the DB context class inside the Entity Framework Core. So we will add a colon here and we will write DB context. Now you will see the red squiggly lines because it does not find or does not know what is this DB context. If you press Ctrl dot here, you will see the using statement inside Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. And DB context is defined inside the Entity Framework Core to access and manage the database. When we are creating a DB context, we need to get the connection string as options. Then once you have configured this, inside this class, we will be creating DB set for all the tables that we want in our database. So the first table that we want is the category model that we created. So in order to create that table, you will have to create a DB set. So we will say public DB set. We will write the model name, which is category. You'll have to press Ctrl dot to add the using statement. And then here, whatever name you give will be the name of the actual database. I will call it the same category, and we will have getter and setter. So here, if you named it category 1, your table name will be category 1. So this is actually the name of the table that you want inside your database. Our application DB context looks good, but we need to do one thing. We have a DB context in our project, and we have connection string inside our appsettings.json. We need to configure this DB context to use our connection string. That way it will know how it can connect to the database. Let's see how we can do that in the next video. Now we need to add the connecting bridge between our DB context and connection string. So we need to tell our application that, hey, you need to use this application DB context to interact as a DB context, and you have to use the SQL Server with connection string that is inside appsettings.json. So all of that mapping will be done inside program.cs, where we are adding services to the container. The reason we are adding that as a service here is once we add it here, we can extract that and use it with dependency injection throughout the application. So we will be adding DB context as a service in our application. Now previously in .NET 5, all of this was done inside startup.cs class file. But starting with .NET 6, they have combined both startup and program.cs into one single file. So here we are adding all the services to the container, and then we are configuring the request pipeline. So now we no longer need multiple files. Everything is much cleaner. So in order to add service to our container, we will say builder.services, and the service that we want to add is DB context. So we want to configure the DB context, which expects a class name. So here we have to tell that which class in our application is implementing DB context. That is application DB context. Once you write that, you will press Ctrl dot to add the using statements for abweb.data. Then here we have to pass the options. So we'll say options here goes to, and we will say options dot we have use SQL Server inside the Entity Framework Core namespace. That way we are saying that for this DB context for database, we want to use SQL Server. And inside here, we have to give the connection string. Now how can we extract our connection string from appsettings.json? I said before that connection string is a special block that is given by the .NET Core team. So that's why they have given a special method to access all the key values inside that special block. You can do that by using builder.configuration. They have given a method getConnectionString that will look for a key name inside appsettings.json. So inside connection strings, what is the key name we should look for? We should look for a key with the name of default connection and we want its value. So we will copy default connection and paste that in the key name when we use getConnectionString. That will actually retrieve the connection string and configure our DB context. Now here you can see with application DB context, we are passing the options. So inside our class, where we have the application DB context, we should retrieve that options and pass that to the base class of DB context. So here we will have constructor using the snippet ctor tab. And with this class, we will receive DB context options on application DB context. We will call that as options. And all we want to do is pass that on to the base class of DB context. Pretty simple and straightforward. But this line of code is very critical. If you do not do that, your connection will not work. Now right now it might seem that we are doing lots of magic things with setting up application DB context, some code in program.cs, and we are retrieving our connection string from the app settings. But this is very basic connection that you have to do with all .NET Core applications when you want to use and configure Entity Framework Core. So this can be treated as basic steps that you should remember and memorize. But what we are doing inside program.cs, we are just adding items to the container so that we can extract and use with the help of dependency injection. As we proceed with the course, dependency injection will make much more sense and you will see how easy it is by adding things to dependency injection to extract when we want to use them. So with that basic configuration, we are almost there. Next thing we have to do is we just need to create our database. We have all the configuration that is ready. Let's see how we can accomplish that in the next video.